Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Thesis Theater with Timothy Francis, who is presenting his thesis, Administrative Art as Genre in Kafka, Tucker, and Ravn, for the Master's Program in Language and Literature at Signum University. My name is Gabriel Schenk, and I was Tim's thesis supervisor. Very pleased to have been in that role. And Tim is going to explain all about his thesis, and we're going to take questions from the audience as well. So fantastic to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming. And Tim, why don't you introduce yourself first of all? Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, my name is Tim Francis, and this is the last sort of 10 meters of my race that I'm running with Signum University for a master's in language and literature. And I moonlight as a recovering bureaucrat in my day job when I'm not a student. And so this thesis was really sort of the bringing together of some different threads in my life, the work life with the study life.
Fantastic. And so tell us about this thesis. What is it about?
Well, someone very wise gave me the advice that we should treat the subject of a thesis like a strange cat in a room that we've never met before. We should approach it, gingerly and cautiously, and perhaps even pretend that we're not there and let the cat come to us. And so it came about a little like that. I knew that I wanted to write about the intersection of bureaucracy and art. I've always been a fan of Kafka, and through Signum's language program, I picked up enough Old Norse to get myself in trouble if I said I was competent in Old Norse. And in order to sort of maintain some fluidity with that, I was reading some Scandinavian literature. And so I came across Olga Ravn's, I'm not sure that it's exactly a novel, but I think she calls it a novel, so I'll call it a novel. The Employees, the Ansatsa, and it just sort of came at exactly the right time to connect this idea of bureaucracy and art. So the thesis really explores that intersection. So what is bureaucracy? What constitutes bureaucracy or administration? And I really enjoyed, like I said, it's part of my professional life as a bureaucrat, but I didn't really have a theoretical framework to talk about my day job. And so researching bureaucracy, what it means, was interesting. And then looking at the historical context of bureaucratic fiction or the depiction of public servants in art and literature specifically. And then sort of these three examples that span from a very early example of it, Kafka's The Trial, to a very contemporary work, the Booker Prize nominated Employees by Olga Ravn. And then there's a nice sandwiched in the middle, sort of a Tucker sandwich, is these two beautiful paintings by sort of a neo-Renaissance painter expressing his frustration with obtaining a license from the New York Housing Department. I think it's a really wonderful trio. And I was sort of guided as much by my own interest as anything else.
Fantastic. Yeah. So just to explain to the audience, this is The Trial by Franz Kafka. So Kafka lived 1883 to 1924, because it's the 100th year anniversary of Kafka's death. So there's a lot of exciting things happening around the world, especially in Oxford, actually. So if you are in Oxford in 2024, do visit the Bodleian Library, where there is going to be a Kafka exhibition. And every student at Oxford University has been given a copy of Kafka's famous short work, The Metamorphoses, which is about someone waking up as a beetle. But you're writing specifically about the trial and a bit about the castle as well. These are two of Kafka's works that he wrote sort of in the 10s and the 20s, that kind of era, and then they were published after he died by his friend Max Brod. And then you've got George Tucker, who is an American artist in between, as you say, and we can't really show pictures of Tucker because of copyright reasons. But if you Google George Tucker subway, and Tucker the bureau, then you will find these images, and please do look them up because they're kind of incredible images of bureaucracy. And then finally, you end with, as you say, Olga Ravn, the employees, which was written, I think, in Dutch, if I'm right.
Danish, yeah.
Danish, thank you. And it is a novel, but it's an extraordinary novel. Tell us a little bit about the employees, about how it's set up.
Well, it came about. She had an artist friend that they wanted to work together, a sculptor, Leah Hesterland, and she made these sort of miraculous objects. Again, we can't show them, but you could look her up. And these sort of, they wanted them to be living, but unalive, and made of things like marble, these fantastic structures. And so Ravn had worked with Hesterland to write about sort of a booklet for the exhibition. And it as all good things do, it started out as a small idea and expanded into something larger, and it ended up being this novel. And I think it's interesting on its own. You could read it, and it's a great read without thinking about it in the context of bureaucracy. What makes it interesting for me, from a bureaucratic point of view, is it's written in the form of HR interviews with the members of a crew of a spaceship that's on an 18-month mission to catalog these objects that line up with the objects from this art exhibition that took place in Copenhagen. And the sort of the committee that oversees this work that they do has collected them all after an incident that occurs at the end of the 18. I'm not sure if I'm going to give any spoilers away, but at the end of the 18 months, there's sort of this momentous happening to the crew that is the climax of the story. So it's written in the form of these HR interviews, but they're very poetic, oblique, difficult to sort of understand, and it's just dense with meaning, imagery, senses. One of her goals, she said, with it was to upset the hierarchy of the senses. And so the sense of smell is referenced in many of the entries. She wanted to have that be more important than the sense of sight in the book. And so that comes across very clearly. I think also, if you looked at early drafts of my thesis, and Dr. Schenk probably remembers them, that just there's so much depth to it. We talked about, like Greek mythology and references to the Aeneid, references to the poetic Edda, all kinds of things there. There's great depths to plumb in that work.
Yeah, definitely. It's an incredible novel. We really recommend it. So as you can see, there's always, it's made up of these short statements, as you say, Tim. These are kind of like HR interviews. So it's actually quite a fast read. And then each one is numbered statement number 54, 56. And it does go through chronologically, but then we're skipping out lots of statements as well. And we don't quite know who is making each statement, and specifically whether they are human or android. I mean, one statement just said, "My body isn't like yours." Well, that can mean anything. So there's, as you said, there's so much to think about in this novel, or this collection of statements. And that was published, I think, 2020 or thereabouts, right?
Yeah, my translation is
yeah.
2020.
And then, as I say, Kafka is writing around the 20s as well. It's a little bit difficult to date Kafka because he was published posthumously. And he sort of worked on things at different points. And then you've got Tucker, who was sort of painting in the mid 20th century. So Subway is 1950. So you've got this nice kind of, I hadn't actually realized until just now, but you go 100 years and you have someone in the middle as well. So that works out beautifully, doesn't it? It's a very bureaucratic way of doing it in some ways.
In my original conception of the thesis, it was actually a little bit more bureaucratic too, because I had originally envisioned sort of using some of the tools that I use in my day job to undertake the analysis. It ended up being a little bit tedious to do it that way, and easier to speak in the language of the work. But
Right.
there is there's this idea of the jobs to be done theory from Clayton Christensen, and he says, you know, like what job did you hire this thing to do? His famous example is he was hired by McDonald's to help them with milkshake sales. It's an excellent video if you want to understand jobs to be done theory. But it kind of fits in this bizarre way with Deleuze and Guattari's notion of their analysis of literature. And given a certain effect, they say, what machine's capable of producing it? And so ask not, you know, instead of asking what literature means or a work of literature means, ask what can it do?
Mm.
And I think that instrumental notion is kind of very much in line with jobs to be done theory. So I think I had that in the back of my mind without necessarily being tediously explicit about it in the thesis.
Yeah, no, I think that does come through. It's just kind of really interesting. I need to think about that more. It sort of reminds me of, you know, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. But and then we were also talking just before the session with this famous quotation from Kafka. So I've got it in German and English, which is, "I'm nothing but literature and can and want to be nothing else," which he wrote in a letter to his fiancée. He was always saying things like this. So there's a kind of a great sense in these writers of doing and being, and that blurring line between work and life and literature, which is kind of fascinating to think about, which really applies to all authors, but particularly these writers are people who've sort of had firsthand experience of bureaucracy. I mean, particularly, I don't know much about Ravn actually, but so, you know, Tucker, you talk about he was trying to get some permit to renovate his apartment, I think, and got frustrated in New York in the 50s. And then Kafka has so many kind of links to bureaucracy. He was trained as a lawyer, and he worked to help people navigate a bureaucratic system to claim compensation for factory injuries. So this was really kind of his life. And you yourself are, as you say, a bureaucrat. So it's sort of fascinating, that kind of blending of kind of work and life and experience and so on.
Well, I think I owe. Oh, sorry.
No,
I
please.
think I owe a previous Signum course, the Gothic, the inspiration, because I wrote a paper about Bram Stoker, and I didn't, you know, the sort of what are those called? The epistolary contents of Dracula, like the manuscript lists and things. You're sort of like, well, this is almost bureaucracy as medium a little bit. Rather like the HR entries. It's these found items. And I didn't realize that Stoker had written a nonfiction book from his own life as a bureaucrat called The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland. And for a long time, it was this sort of textbook for clerks in Ireland to understand what their job was, how to do their job, and what processes were sort of entailed in that job. And it reminds me of the book in the trial when Joseph is trying to understand how the trial works, and he goes to the courtroom the day after his initial sort of hearing, and the woman is cleaning. He wants to see the book that has, because it's the process book. It very much like Stoker's process book. It's, you know, oh, you shouldn't look at it. I can't let you see it. And he's, you know, he looks at it, and it's just full of, you know, crudely drawn pornographic drawings. And the title is "Torments Greta Had to Suffer from Her Husband Hans." You know, and it's just this absurd thing. But if you encounter bureaucracy, some real life bureaucracy isn't actually that much better when we're trying to sort of penetrate and understand how the process of renewing our driver's license or passport works or something like that. We really don't have much more to go on than a pornographic book called "Torments Greta Had to Suffer from Her Husband Hans."
Exactly, yeah, and the original, the German title of the trial is Die Prozess, or the process, right? So that kind of idea of process is really important. I believe in the German that the process can refer to both the trial itself and the process leading up to the trial. But that's a fascinating comment on Stoker. I think we did talk a bit about Stoker in the early days of this thesis process, and I hadn't thought about that since, and I didn't know that about his book. And you're right, Dracula is sort of defeated by Mina's sort of knowledge of the train timetable and being able to organize all the data and type it all up and to sort it in chronological order and to look for patterns and sort of being a clerk, being an office worker, being um, an organizer. These are kind of bureaucratic processes. And then the other kind of interesting thing there is Stoker as theatre manager at the Lyceum, which was, I suppose, to some extent a bureaucratic role. You could think of it like that, but certainly a theatrical role, and the possibility that Dracula is based on Henry Irving or possibly a few other people, but certainly there's that theatrical element of Dracula. And there's certainly a theatrical element in Kafka as well, very inspired by Yiddish theatre. So that was one of the things that was in your thesis, and I said, well, either you talk about it a lot or you don't talk about it at all, so you cut it out. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on theatricality and bureaucracy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It is interesting because I think it's chapter 1 or chapter 2 when Kay says, this could all just be a fantastic joke being played by my colleagues at the bank, but I'm not gonna let on, and I'll just play along with this theatrical thing that's had this fantastic joke that's happening. So there's that aspect of the direct reference to the theater, but then even in our real life bureaucratic language, I can't speak for the UK, but in Canada, what by convention, when we take on a new role, we're said to be acting in that role. You're called an actor in that role, and the jobs are separated from the people as they're explained in Canadian bureaucratic documents, where the position and the duties of the position are divorced from the person in it. So the person in it is called the actor who undertakes this stuff, and you kind of gives a different twist on the expression like performance management or like end of the year performance reports, because you think usually of performance like key performance indicators or what did you accomplish these milestones or something like that. But when you talk about performance and you're thinking, well, I'm an actor in a role and you're measuring my performance, there is this sort of underlying connotation of being like an actor on a stage. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's really interesting. And I suppose there is a sense in bureaucracy of it being a little bit fake. Like, you don't really have to, like, in order to renovate your apartment, you shouldn't really have to fill out some forms. That's a kind of like I can understand why it's necessary, but it's also fake. It's also kind of, there's a bit of kind of theatricality there in the sense that it's kind of like an additional layer or something like that. And so I think that's probably what Kafka's sort of getting at with the book of the process is like this pornographic book, because it's like a prop. It's not real.
Right.
In the sense. Right. Yeah. Really interesting.
What ties into in the thesis, I talk a bit about the anthropologist David Graeber, who recently passed away, in his Utopia of Rules, which is 3 essays on bureaucracy. And he talks a lot about play and sort of how unfettered play is what gives rise to rules, and games that we play become increasingly sophisticated until the rules become too complex to follow, and we have to return to the to sort of free play to establish a new set of rules. And so I think that idea of sort of an improvisation within structures leading to a more formal documents, whether you're talking about a process or a play or a trial for that matter, or a painting even. And I think that there's something in there as well, that that's how we negotiate rules. I think he's right on with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to go back to the Gothic idea, but before we go any further, I want to just clarify your arguments, because you're not just writing generally about bureaucratic literature and art. You're actually exploring the concept of genre and what we mean by bureaucratic art, or administrative art is the term you use.
Mhm.
So can you just tell us a little bit more about your argument and that term administrative art?
Yeah, absolutely. In the early days of thinking through this thesis, I was sort of looking for something to hang on to, some signposts or methodological ideas that had come previously. And right around the time of the publication of the trial, actually, Humbert Wolff actually wrote a brief paper called "Some Public Servants in Fiction," or some public figures in fiction. And he did a survey of English language literature to date that had featured as main characters bureaucrats or some form of bureaucrats. The subject goes cold for about 30 years, around until the time of the painting of Government Bureau, when H.J. Friedsam, writes a follow-up paper called "Bureaucrat as Hero" is his contention. So he looks at literature from the point of view of when, and he has very strict criteria that sort of match this idea of what would constitute an administrative novel, and those ideas are sort of developed. So as part of my literature review, I do look at the evolution in thinking of administrative fiction and the administrative. There's not an official term. I don't think anybody sort of landed on, this is what we'll all agree amongst ourselves to call this type of work. So administrative art just seems to speak to that. And although it didn't make the final cut in the paper, I did look at some sort of other mediums. I did investigate sort of administrative music, of which there are some really interesting examples, as well as some more bureaucracy as medium works.
And I think so your argument is about exploring this term and testing this term, and I think you're arguing also that whilst we can apply a checklist mentality to genre, that's not really going to work all the time. If you actually apply it to specific texts, what you found when you look at Kafka and Ravn and Tucker is that they do fit into this mold somewhat, but then they challenge the mold too. They're doing their own thing. There are some clear examples where it doesn't really fit into administrative fiction. So Lord of the Rings isn't really an administrative novel, but even something like the Jack Reacher texts that I don't know much about, but it's so, explain that. There's someone working in an office.
I think Jack Ryan and the Tom Clancy books, furnish a pretty good example, because that is a senior bureaucrat as hero. He's the hero of the Tom Clancy novels, as far as I know. And he's primarily an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, working in the Pentagon. Where I think he would fail to meet Friedsam's definition is that Friedsam really wants the climax of the story and the important parts, the act of heroism. He wants it to be an administrative act of heroism. And so what happens is that with the Jack Ryan character, he sort of gathers intelligence in his analyst role, but then when he goes out into the field, he's sort of a superhero type figure, and there's lots of violence and killing action. So I would, I think you could reasonably argue that Jack Ryan would make an interesting study for an administrative work, but I think where Friedsam would maybe say it's not working as an administrative art would be that the character leaves his administrative roots behind when he transforms into an action hero.
Right. Whereas Dracula might fit the mold, even though it's not, it's someone who isn't sort of that administrative office job, desk duty person, but then actually he applies those skills.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about Dracula, is that organizational aptitude overcomes evil, in that case. So that very much is a bureaucratic act, or a series of bureaucratic acts are the ones that drive the story.
Yeah. And I looked up Jack Reacher. It's a different stories. I'm going to get my Jacks confused. So it's Jack Ryan we were talking about. But excellent. Well, let's go back to Gothic. And at this point, I'd like to say how delighted we both were that Dr. Amy H. Sturgis, the legendary Dr. Amy H. Sturgis, was able to be the second reader for this thesis. And just to explain, hello, Dr. Sturgis. Great to see you.
Hello.
Great to
Thank
see you with Mary and Edgar as well.
Thank you very much.
And just to explain to people, the second reader is someone who sort of is beamed down from the stratosphere and hasn't read the thesis before, just really coming in completely blind, which is incredibly useful for us because after, it's a long process. It lasts about a year. And so I get confused about what we've sort of talked about in the past and what is and isn't in the final version. And then the second reader is an expert in the field, comes in and reads the thesis completely fresh and is able to apply their expertise to that. So it was incredibly helpful having you come in. What were your thoughts on Tim's thesis, Dr. Sturgis?
Well, I was delighted to be involved in any way because this taught me a great deal. It also, this thesis does so many things I appreciate. Interrogating genre and asking, is there a there? And if so, how is it useful to think about it? To look at ideas across time. And as you pointed out, this is covering a nice century of work. Also, moving across media, I think is really important. And I think that's a great strength of this thesis, because blowing that up from the novel to art allows for a much bigger conversation. And also because these works, particularly Kafka, but all three of them have been studied in a way, there's already some interrogation of these works and conversation about them. And I really admired how Tim was able to engage with each of those conversations and yet tie them together with something that is a unique contribution. And I think the way this thesis puts forth the idea of administrative art as something that is both useful, but also something that we have to appreciate as living and evolving and nebulous in a way, which makes it, in a sense, more useful, is an invitation for more conversation. It's a real contribution. And I appreciate the fact that this isn't just adding into a conversation, but I think it will start more. I hope, I would love to hear from Tim what his plans are with this, because I hope there's a next step for this work, because I think it deserves to have a wide audience.
It's a great question. I wish I had a really fantastic answer to it. I've sort of been, as Dr. Schenk mentioned, it's been a year, so it's this sort of like being in it, and it's kind of hard to believe that it's finished, that it's ending, that this part of the journey at least will be over. So I think when you had read it and sent me an email about it with your feedback, and it's sort of like, this just struck me in that instant just how final this was in terms of this particular stage of my life, or something like that, or this educational journey, whatever it is. And it's been so fun, and like, we've referenced the Gothic class, but like that was your class that you taught, right? So it's something that we've been engaged in together very much for a long time. And so when you said, like, I hope you find an opportunity to publish this, like I would love that, to be honest. And bureaucracy is something that I really appreciate Kafka saying, when he read the trial to people, that he would often have trouble getting through it because he would be laughing so hard. And you read it's like, hey, I don't know if I necessarily see that, right away. But I do really think that the bureaucracy does have this level of absurdity to it, that as a reader of it, as an appreciator of it, but also as a worker in it, I love bureaucracy and its absurdities, and I love sharing that, and that I've somehow sort of shared this thing that's been so central to my life, as an employee of bureaucratic systems, as a mover in and through bureaucratic systems. I like being able to share something about my reflection in those systems. So I would love to take this further in some sort of like publishing milieu or something, or at least present it, you know.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, presenting would be great as well. Yeah. Sorry, Dr. Sturgis, did you want to come in at that point?
Oh, I was just going to say that that would be fabulous. And you did put your finger on something else that struck me when I was reading this the first time, and realizing your background, it
Yeah.
unlocked for me some of the connections you were making. I don't think someone from outside could have drawn the connected the dots in the same way. I think your perspective really unlocked some things that would be much more opaque for the outsider. Your insider knowledge, in other words, and your lived experiences really informed this in a meaningful way. And that's another thing that you bring to this, besides the time span and the multimedia perspective here. This is infused with insights that come from writing, you know, making the call inside the house, as it were, as outside. So I really appreciated that too, because that's research that couldn't be done except through a lifetime, you know?
Right.
Yeah, that perspective is really important. And I think, just to blow our own horn for a moment, Signum University, one of the best things about teaching at Signum is the fact that we get students like you, Tim, who come in from all kinds of different backgrounds and life experiences, and are able to use those working life experiences. I mean, one of my other thesis students, Mark Lockneat, wrote about hackers in literature, and he himself has worked in cybersecurity all his life and in hacking. I think that was one of the theses that I shared with you early on, to sort of to think about kind of an approach to this topic. Because there's some similarities there with the kind of the history of ideas, and that's really where you come in as well, Dr. Sturgis, as an expert in the history of ideas and genre. And I think, yeah, it's interesting about that Gothic class. This is the Gothic tradition course at Signum University, and other courses that you've taught. You do challenge genre restrictions, and you don't want to limit things to just, you know, literature, whatever literature is. You know, if we can bring in an example from a TV show or a piece of music or art, that's great, right? That's just as valid as anything else. So that was really nice to have that influence, not just you as the second reader, but you as a lecturer at Signum University. Quite a few years ago now, that Gothic course, I think, was maybe 2015, and yet it's still kind of paying off. You know, almost a decade later, it's actually filtering through the system, and people who took that course are then going on to do their theses inspired by your approach as well. So that's fantastic. And Tim, do you want to say anything more about Dr. Sturgis's courses? Because I think you took more than just Gothic tradition.
I don't know if we have time for me to, you know, and I don't know if Dr. Sturgis would be comfortable. I could probably make her uncomfortable if I talked about how much I loved her courses. But yeah, and especially the last few, because, you know, and I think I mentioned this already, Dr. Sturgis, but I was making a list of upcoming courses that I wanted to take, and I was sort of talking with the registrar, and I said, you know, I think I'd like to do these courses, and she said, but you're done, like you've done all the courses that it's time to start your thesis. And I had been so wrapped up in the last few courses that I had taken, which was sci-fi and the Gothic tradition, were the last two that I'd taken. That and I don't remember, it was one of yours, maybe it was the dystopian, that one, but it was one that was upcoming, that was another one of yours, that I thought, oh well, geez, like how did I suddenly finish all of the requirements of a degree without really thinking it? So I was definitely sort of lost in the moment and just enjoying the courses so much that I didn't really think about the the output. I was thinking I was enjoying the process so much that I lost sight of the outcome.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you so much. And I love the back and forth and the cross-pollination too, because I was just thinking, you mentioned the dystopia course, and I was thinking as I started reading your thesis, you know, this reminds me of the film Brazil. And then the next paragraph you mentioned Brazil, and it's all connected, right? But you've just given me a completely different way to think about that. And the fact that this is all in conversation, right? We're all thinking about the same ideas and interrogating the same things with that kind of openness and that sort of fluidity. That means a lot. But thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, we had read, we is on the reading list of the sci-fi course, Yevgeny Zamyatin's book, and where that book is kind of a response to Taylorism and Frederick Taylorism, The Principles of Scientific Management, 1910. It's funny because that's the subject that, like, Taylorism is something that I teach to government, like to bureaucrats in the Canadian government when I teach a 3-day course. And Taylorism is one of the first subjects that we cover. And so here, seeing it sort of like this is the theoretical concept, and here it is imagined as dystopian literature. You know, it's kind of, I don't teach it as a positive thing. I teach it sort of as it's a more neutral thing that could go in different ways. And obviously Zamyatin sort of took it in a largely negative way. But it's interesting because it had this wonderful connection, and then getting to talk about Taylor in the thesis was great. It was a highlight for me to sort of be able to mention this set of ideas that I had, that I was intimately familiar with, but not at all from a literary standpoint.
Love that.
Yeah, it's great. And Dr. Suchis, I had the same feeling when I was reading through, and I was thinking of Duncan Jones's film Moon, which I'd never thought of as bureaucratic. I just thought it was a weird film set on the moon. It was a great film. But certainly after reading Tim's thesis, now I'm kind of looking at that in a different way and thinking about kind of the character being stuck in a process and so on. And so, you know, it is this idea of administrative art can go through all these different genres and settings, whatever we mean by genre. I love the way you talked about this as being a living thing, right? Dr. Sturgis, just now you said living thing, and the way that the Gothic tradition course isn't the Gothic genre, it's the Gothic tradition. It gives us a bit more flexibility to think of that as a living thing, and people being influenced by each other as well. And so, Tim, presumably this is kind of, if we're pulling out some sort of wider comments on literature and art and stories. This is something you subscribe to, rather than sort of say, you know, there's got to be a checklist where if you don't fill these criteria, then you are not counted as administrative art. It's much more kind of fluid and organic and living, right?
I think it's not a checklist. Like it's clues. You know, it's more like you know, if you're watching, you know, I love the show Severance. I'm excited for a season 2 of Severance. I think if you were watching a show like Severance or Loki, or you know, or reading a novel, you would sort of see these little clues that you would sort of say, oh, okay, this is sort of a conspicuous hierarchy, or this is that person doesn't know what this person does because of the separation of duties, or something like that. And I think you would just pick up these sort of clues, and you would say, this looks a lot like administrative art. And, you know, should I, could I look at it differently, understanding that it may or may not constitute administrative art, and what does that mean, or what does that say to me as a consumer of this thing? And so I think with Severance, what I think is interesting is when you go to work, you have this sort of chip in your brain, and you have no memory of the person that you are outside of work. So your work persona is only your work persona. It has no connection with your real life. and your real life has no connection with your working life. Like the memories aren't shared. And I think it poses this really challenging question that who am I at work? Like, yes, severance exists at this extreme of, well, you're no one but your work persona, but to what extent, am I as a bureaucrat versus me in this meeting right now as a student of literature? Where does the Tim stop and start? And one of the questions they ask in Severance that I really like is one of the work personas says to one of the others, sounds like the setup for a bad joke, but says, do you think that the other version of me laughs at the same jokes? And I think that's a really potent ontological question about, what it means to be me, what it means to be myself, and what it means to be the person who does something in a workplace that is disconnected from myself. And we hear platitudes in workplaces about bringing your authentic self, and we hear about work-life balance, and these are themes in contemporary workplaces. And I think Severance makes a series of really wonderful points through asking questions like, who are you if not yourself? What do you leave behind when you're disconnected from your memories of self?
Yeah, and I think you'll miss a lot of that if you were just seeing it as administrative novel or TV show or whatever, and sort of siloing it off into this kind of separate genre that is only about bureaucracy or about work life and not about kind of these deeper questions that all art is really kind of fundamentally about. Who are we, right? As one of the big questions that we grapple with when we engage with art and fiction. So yeah, that's wonderful. I love that idea of clues and genre defining rather than a checklist. So thank you again, Dr. Sturgis. Any last comments or questions for Tim?
I want to say congratulations on a job well done, a thesis well done, and on the future of this work. And thank you again for bringing me along for a delightful ride and an education. Because like I said, this will influence the way I look at things, and I look forward to others getting to experience this analysis and learn from it as well. So thank you and congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's fantastic. How wonderful. So we've got about 15 minutes left of our session. Owen Chris Swank, librarian Chris Swank and faculty member Chris Swank, Professor Swank, writes Great and Unique Project. And it's great to hear from the audience as well. Please do send in questions and comments through the chat. We'd love to hear from them, and I can pose those questions to Tim. Hard as you like. He's very intelligent and he knows the subject very well. So he will answer anything that you throw at him. But whilst you're thinking of questions and comments, I've got a few more questions left to ask. So one of these is actually a bit of a nasty one because it's something I'm genuinely curious about. And I was talking to a friend of mine, Dr. Nathan Fleeson, who was the person who got me onto Tucker, because I read an article by him in draft form where he was talking about Cadmus, Tucker, and Wilde. And I was giving some feedback to him about that. And the end result of that article was that Tucker was taken out. He took Tucker out, and but Tucker went into my brain, and then I told you about Tucker, and then that went into this thesis. So give that as an example of how research sometimes works. We think of research as being solitary in our libraries, cut off from everyone, but sometimes it's talking to people and reading other people's work and drafts and so on. But I was talking to Dr. Fleeson about Tucker and bodies, because this is something that comes up in Tucker's work. His body parts are sort of everywhere, and we talked about the Stations of the Cross that Tucker did, and that you talk about this in your thesis as well. That the Stations of the Cross in Tucker's version, which is a kind of a representation of Jesus doing various things in the day of his crucifixion. Tucker's version just focuses on like a hand or an eye or something like that, or a gesture. And then in his art, so in the bureau, for example, you've got these windows, and again, you have to search for this. Tucker bureau. It's an incredible picture. You see kind of just people's eyes sort of framed in sort of portholes in office sort of cubicles. And when I was talking to Dr. Fleeson about this, we were both sort of saying, like, we're both interested in this, but we don't really know what to say about it. And then sort of applying this to Ravn and Kafka, there's a lot about bodies in their work as well. I mean, Kafka's always thinking about the body, and the trial ends with a very bodily conclusion. It becomes very kind of physical and violence, whereas it has been kind of quite notional and academic. And then Ravn, it's this again, it's a similar kind of ending, but without spoiling anything. But there's also this kind of focus on bodies throughout. So this is kind of an open question to you. Do you have any concepts, any theories about what bodies are doing in these works, and how do they belong in this bureaucratic fiction?
Well, I think Tucker's case is a really interesting one because he paints the Stations of the Cross and like he's a latecomer to Catholicism. I think he was an Episcopalian, like familial elite, and came to Catholicism later in life, post government bureau, post subway. And when he was asked to paint the Stations of the Cross, he said, I'm paraphrasing, so I take it with a grain of salt, that people bring so much of their own experience to a work such as Stations of the Cross, because there's other Stations of the Cross. That people bring so much of themselves and their own experience to it, but he didn't want to interfere with that. He said he wanted to give them something that they could connect with, that they wouldn't overrule their pre-existing notions of the suffering of Christ. And I think, not that bureaucracy is anything as grand as that, but you do have these sort of disembodied aspects of the bureaucrat, that there's something just sort of reductive and instrumental about them, when the people standing in line in the bureau or in the subway, they're not quite whole people, but they're mostly whole people. They're sort of faceless because they're turned away from us. But the bureaucrats are directly engaging with the viewer of the painting. They're staring right at us. But they're only a disembodied eye and a disembodied hand. The rest of the view of them is obscured by this thing. So I think in maybe the same way, we're bringing our, to depict a horrific bureaucracy. You can't quite spell it out. It would be too literal, maybe. So to just have the eye gazing at us. It's like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, when he looks out and sees the eye of the octopus and it ensnares the ship. He doesn't see the whole body of the octopus. It's the eye alone is sufficient to capture this terror. And so the eye of the bureaucrat staring out at us through this little peephole, it may be something along those lines. And Ravn 2 has some connection with eyes.
Yeah, and noses, as you say.
Yes.
Yeah, smells.
There's one of the humanoids, or humanoids in the employees are non-humans. They're sort of artificial. They're sort of Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation-esque beings. When there's a dramatic event, at some point somebody is stringing a bunch of eyeballs on a thread, and there's something, the Ravn is there's a number of like disembodied body part, like where it's detached from its owner, I guess I would say.
And just flipping that to the people in the sort of interacting with the bureaucracies and the bureaucrats. I think there's a reminder that even though these processes are kind of more than human, I mean, they're academic, they're theoretical, they're legal, there's a physicality to the people involved in them as well. So I'm thinking of the Futurama episode when they go to the center bureaucracy and they're all waiting in line, and they've been waiting. Some people have been waiting for like decades, and suddenly the line kind of pushes back, the queue pushes back, and someone announces, "Oh, someone's had a baby," because they've been waiting in line for so long. So they're stuck in this process that is kind of non-human, but there is the reminder that we are not elements of bureaucracy ourselves. We are physical beings,
Right.
and we can be killed, or we can have babies, or we can do all those sort of things.
I think there's something very indirectly empathetic in the Tucker, though, and that is that the people in line, we can't see, we can only see sort of this perspective of their head.
Yeah.
So you can't quite see their eyes, and their hands are in their pockets. So we see their completeness minus their eyes and hands, whereas the bureaucrats behind the screens, we see only their eyes and hands to the exception of anything else. So I think on the one hand, it could be, you know, this the loss of agency and autonomy. The sort of the state has taken our eyes and hands from us and is now using them to surveil us. But also that the state is using as a tool parts of ourselves as and our fellow humans. It's not the state. It's people that we would recognize as fellow humans who are doing this to us.
Yeah. That's an important point. Well, I have a question now from Dr. Sarah Brown, who wasn't able to attend live because she's traveling at the moment. But she didn't specifically send this question in for you, but I bet it's a question I know she likes to ask at every Thesis Theater, and it's a fantastic question, which is, how did you find the thesis process? And what tips do you have for future thesis students?
It's a great question, and I really enjoyed it, and I expected this question or some variation of it coming, so I did make a couple notes if you see me glancing over at my page. So I would say I referenced it before, but Dr. Schenk's advice about approaching the topic obliquely and indirectly and in a sort of exploratory or discovering curious frame of mind was incredibly helpful. Something I struggled with a little bit that, again, Dr. Schenk, you were very helpful with was killing your darlings or having someone else around to kill them for you. One of the books that I read early on, I referenced like, needing to sort of brush up on the theoretical aspect of what constitutes bureaucracy. And I read The Administrative State by Dwight Waldo, which was a slog. Like it's a really long book. It's really detailed, and it took me a really long time to get through. And once I got through it, I couldn't let go of the idea that it had to be really central to the work. But actually, by the time I got through it, I realized that it wasn't actually that great or that relevant. And Chris Swank has some great advice. You know, don't kill them, just resurrect them later for another project. So it was tough to let go of that a little bit, but it was also great practice. The sustained effort just over the course of time. On the one hand, it is a year from when we first talked about this until today. It has been about a year. Hopefully, there's not two gentlemen waiting for me outside with a knife, like in the process, but fingers crossed. But it wasn't necessarily like, every day, sitting down at the computer and working. And there's a writer I really like, John Swartzwelder. He wrote for The Simpsons, most famously. And he had a great piece of advice. He would, in the evening, he would just write garbage, like the worst episode of The Simpsons that you'd ever read. And he didn't care because he was a great editor, he said, not a great writer. He was a great editor. So in the morning, when he went to work, he would say, this episode is terrible, but at least he wasn't staring at a blank page, and he would edit it, and he would come up, obviously, The Simpsons, pretty famous show, and he would come up with comedy gold. And I think the lesson there is not to do what he did necessarily. It's to play to your strengths and to work in a way that makes sense for you as much as possible, and not try to sort of impose on yourself a different style of working. then then makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think still finding ways to sort of, per Desmond Tutu, the only way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. So recognize that it's a long journey and figure out how you're going to consume that elephant.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think figuring out how you're going to tackle this is one of the big challenges of writing a thesis, and being kind of open to exploring different ways of doing things. The foundations course is quite useful for setting up students to do this. I think I mean, you've referred to some of the concepts from that course. So did you find that helpful?
I didn't actually take that
Oh, you didn't
course.
do that? No,
So I would actually not be a very good person to speak to that. Although I did do
yeah.
enough courses with Dr. Acker that I feel like she did a lot of things that set me up for success.
Yeah.
Between Dr. Brown, sort of who has been very encouraging throughout this, and just an incredible sort of champion of my thinking, I guess, if I can say it that way. And Dr. Acker, who's just an incredible, knows how to get the job done and how to do it right. What's the sort of the pragmatic side of getting the work done. She's just been fantastic at helping me through that. So I think between the two of them, through most of my Signum courses, I was lucky to sort of benefit from each of their perspectives, and they both brought something totally different and something that I needed.
Yeah.
So I would recommend Dr. Acker's course. And if I had needed another credit, we talked about it a year ago.
Yeah.
I would have, we talked about taking that course. So
yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, I was thinking, because the example of the cats, approaching the cats is my example. I do that in the foundation course, so that's what made me think you'd taken that course. But instead, sort of, I think you just sort of absorbed the ideas from the teachers directly, which is another way of doing it. But it sounds like the foundation course is sort of helps you set up to do that as well. So fantastic.
I would actually say one other thing about the thesis experience, and I have my Papa mug. So my little people who are in my life have been not particularly helpful in direct ways. At 6, 4, and 1, they didn't have a lot of feedback. But from my very first course with Signum, Henry, who's now 4, he was 1. Wow. And they were days that he was on my lap when we were doing readings of the Poetic Edda in Old Norse. And my partner Chelsea's here this afternoon. So one thing that made the course a lot easier was having people in your life who supported you in it. So it wasn't just the direct things that made this journey possible, but also sort of those indirect things as well. So I couldn't not acknowledge the tremendous debt that I owe them.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful to hear. And as a teacher at Signum, we are kind of sometimes aware of kind of, I mean, everyone has these lives and so on, and we kind of get glimpses into those lives, but it's nice to hear sort of specifically about your children and your partner and so on. And wonderful to think of one of your children sort of growing up alongside your master's process as well. That's fantastic. So we're sort of coming to the end of our time. Very quickly, you did mention the time element of your thesis, and I know time is an important part of the works you've looked at as well. We were talking just before the start of how the trial carries on for a year from birthday to birthday, not too dissimilar to the thesis process. So that's just something else you're kind of interested in, and you have this kind of great sort of phrase about Tucker being in the eternal moment, and then Kafka being about the kind of the timings of the process itself, and then Ravn as well, kind of this sense of time moving forward through the statements as well. So that's just another element of your work that you were interested in. But we've also got a comment from Dr. Sturgis, who says, by the way, if Tim ever makes an administrative art music playlist, I hope he will share it with us. I definitely second that. Please do share that with us. And congratulations from me. It's been a pleasure to be your supervisor. Really enjoyed working with you and thinking about this topic. I think I completely agree with Dr. Sturgis. It's an important topic, and I think you've made a contribution to that conversation that should and will, I'm sure, influence others. And I look forward to hearing more from you and seeing where you take this next. If you want to present it somewhere, if you can publish it somewhere, if you can develop these ideas, especially as you kind of combine your life experience as a bureaucrat with your knowledge and expertise in literature and art more generally. So good luck with that. That's this isn't really the end of the process. This is the real process begins here. Right? You know, this was just the setup. So this is like a kind of conversation that Kay has in the cathedral. It's like, no, the trial hasn't even started yet. That's basically what's happening here. The real process continues on and goes on forever. So, and in many ways, that's a nice thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Schenk.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And great to have, exactly. Round of applause from Dr. Sturgis and Professor Swank as well. So it's wonderful to have that, and well done, Tim. And thank you for writing this thesis and sharing it with us today. Okay, excellent. Great to see everyone. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.